Hey everybody, it's Tom, and I wanted to come to you today at length to discuss third little work of Paulo Freire before going on to Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which was actually an article published, it was republished in 1998 at the Harvard Educational Review. It was initially published in the 60s, so the exact date escapes me at the moment. I will post a link in the description to ameliorate that deficit. In any event, the article in question, The Adult Literacy Process as Cultural Action for Freedom. The Adult Literacy Process as Cultural Action for Freedom. And what is unfolded in this article, which runs roughly 40 pages, again, are many of the themes that we've discussed so far in reviewing the contents of this volume, Education for Critical Consciousness, which contained education as a practice of freedom and extension or communication. It's also an apt anticipation of Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And he opens by reminding us that every theory of education which is put forth has within it a position as the relationship between human beings and reality, or his phrase, man and the world in translation. And what he notes is that often, again, we've seen this before, the dominant modes of education, the dominant theories and the dominant methods reflect a unidirectional sensibility, a mechanistic sensibility with regard to the relationship between the knower and the known, between the teacher and the student. So he's really actually stepping outside of the manner in which the Enlightenment and theories of mind which we inherit from the Enlightenment, from John Locke, etc., suggest that the mind is simply sort of like a photographic plate or a blank slate, tabula rasa, upon which reality impresses itself through the medium of our senses and some degree of modification through our understanding or mental faculties. We occupy as knowers an essentially passive role in that process, and insofar as we then become engaged in transmitting what we inherit from that process, the activity which is undertaken to attain that transmission has the quality of a extension or imposition that does not necessarily respect the role of the student as an active participant in the broader context. This mechanical viewpoint, this mechanistic viewpoint around learning, around our relationship with the world, is in Freire's assessment also what informs many efforts to transmit literacy, not simply among children, but adult literacy, where you have populations which are not in possession of the skill set to fall under the umbrella of the literate. Now, here is where we have to begin to exhibit caution, because this term, or this dyad, the literate versus the illiterate, often becomes a touchstone which is invoked to justify the marginalization of those who are not literate, as it were. Now, before I expand on that point, let me quickly rejoin the theory of education, which I just outlined, the mechanistic theory, with the one advanced by Freire, which is dialectical. What I mean by that, what he means by that, at least insofar as I understand it, is that knowing is not simply a process of receiving or having some set of facts or concepts impressed on one's consciousness. Rather, there is an activity, a creative interaction between the subject reaching out into the world and the world responding. So to know is not simply to memorize, but to engage the object in a deep way that actually ends up transforming the object and the person who is engaged in this process. And so the world itself is actually altered, changed, transformed, transmuted by our engagement, our process, our learning of it. It's a dynamic and exciting alternative way of seeing the entire process of education, and also serves to ramify powerfully to alter our sense of what is the relationship between the teacher and the student. And no longer do we have this idea of unidirectional transmission, mirroring the mechanistic framework, which we mentioned a few moments ago. Rather, the teacher and the student enter into a conversation which is mediated by the object, in which everyone is informed, transformed, and through which everyone informs and transforms. And the process is not simply dialectical, it is dialogical. So, what becomes conspicuous under this alternative framing is that the notion of people being absolutely ignorant is dissipated. That notion actually figures powerfully, though implicitly, in dominant modes of education where you have this transmission framework. The student doesn't know anything, so they have to be told. And when it comes to literacy, this idea that the people whom we're going to teach to read don't know anything also serves to greatly problematicize, damage the process. Because in the first place, they do know something. Just the fact that we are people of language indicates that we all have something that we know about reality. And so it's not a question of those who know. It's only helping messianically those who don't know. It's rather those of us who might know a little, helping out those who simply know maybe not quite as much, or they know something differently. In other words, there's no point where one's relative knowledge base becomes a legitimate way in which to establish or justify a disequilibrium of power. And that's what happens, right? And that's why the category of literacy deserves to be interrogated. To be literate under or through Freire's perspective is not simply to acquire a certain facility in reading written words. It is to acquire a facility, even the word acquire is problematic, but to, let us say, cultivate one's capacity to engage other people and the world in a conscious fashion that is abetted, assisted by the ability to read. And then the process of reading is then just not a question of transcribing phonetics. It's a question of entering into a different kind of relationship with your own language that then also opens up into an interrogation of what is disclosed by the printed or the spoken word about your environment in a deeper way. So adult literacy efforts should seek not simply to transmit the technical dimensions of the reading process. They should seek to encourage through that process the cultivation of a critical consciousness that empowers those who are involved in that process to realize what it is to be a human being. And what it is to be a human being is to understand that one's relationship with reality is dynamic and an opportunity to create, engage, and realize ideals such as freedom, creativity, art, love, all the rest of it. And inevitably, it is hoped, the development of that consciousness will translate into also a political sensibility whereby those who oftentimes are beginning from a place of oppression or disenfranchisement to come to a more helpful consciousness about their situation, which allows them to change and participate in the transformation of that situation. And the article really is split into two halves. The first, sort of running over the ground that I've glossed here, about literacy being not simply a mechanical skill, but something which needs to be relayed in a fashion that is grounded by this alternative theory and thus alternative dialogical model of education and of empowerment. The latter half of the article sort of goes from there and in deeper, to a deeper extent, looks at how that consciousness can be transformed in politically significant ways, drawing on experiences in Brazil and in South America more generally through the 60s and the 70s. And here you see the themes that we were referring to in the other videos, such as the notion that consciousness begins with a sort of semi-transitive quality where, just in virtue of being a human being, you have some sense of being able to engage the world, but it's often very muted. As you awaken to that in a fuller way, there's a movement from semi-transitivity or intransitivity to transitivity, transitive consciousness, which reaches out and engages the world, but it is yet naive, sometimes inflected and by emotionalism, which isn't to be dismissed out of hand, but which can sometimes create distortions that can be leveraged to instigate regression to a critical consciousness, which is more powerfully progressive, dynamic, and leading to a more emancipated and emancipating relationship with the real. One thing he talks about in the latter half of the article is there are parts of it in the first part as well, but the notion of being able to place one's own world, one's own way of seeing the world, into an objectified perspective, which, standing outside of that perspective allows you to move beyond it, to transform it so that you can enter into yet an even more expansive and embracing perspective. And then, the process repeats. This critical consciousness' ability to abstract and move beyond then serves as a powerful antidote to being detained by a merely ideological position, a merely sectarian position, where you are, to borrow a phrase from elsewhere, enclosed within a circle of certitude. And that is actually antithetical to the dynamism, which is integral to the process of freedom itself. Doesn't mean that everything is just absolute crazy pants change. There's a tension, and he uses the language from Henri Bergson about time, a dialectic around the notion of duration versus change. So it's not just that things are so unconstrained in their motion as to defy any sort of stability. It's rather that there is a tension between the stable and and the mutable, which is what really gives a process a coherence and a vitality. And it's really impressive the degree to which he is drawing on these other traditions, existentialism, phenomenology, philosophy, and so on, and from so many different vantage points. Really, that just as a ancillary remark speaks to the depth of Paulo Freire's own learning. An impressive person. And this I'm going to conclude just by expressing my gratitude that a person like this was around, and that we can all be a person like this. We can all contribute to the world in a positive and transforming way. That's really what Paulo is about, and that's the mantle we should all take up. So I'll leave it right there. And thanks, guys, for listening. And hopefully we'll get a quick turnaround and get some videos up about pedagogy of the oppressed here in short order. All right. See you guys later.